ABIM pass rates just hit their lowest point in at least 5 years, and they're still dropping. In 2025, 1 in 7 first-time takers failed. That's over 1,500 physicians who finished residency, studied for the exam, and didn't pass. For endocrinology, it's 1 in 5. For nephrology, it's 1 in 6. Everyone blames COVID, but I looked at the burnout data, the USMLE pass rates, and what I'm seeing in my own coaching, and the numbers don't add up. Plus, the exam hasn't changed, so something else did. The internal medicine pass rate was 88% in 2021, and it's been dropping every year since. The next 3 years it was 87%, and then this past year it was 86%. This 2025 exam cohort is the lowest in the ABIM's current published data. Now, before 2021, pass rates were in the low 90s. Some years it went as high as 93%. So we've gone from roughly a 7% failure rate to a 14% failure rate over the course of about 5 years. That's virtually a doubling. The thing that makes this even more shocking is that the number of people taking the exam is growing. In 2021, it was 9,500 takers, and in 2025, it was 10,700. So in absolute terms, the number of physicians failing has grown at an even faster rate than the failure rate itself. Over 1,500 doctors failed in 2025 alone. Note that it isn't just internal medicine that's being hit. Subspecialties are getting it as well. In endocrinology, the pass rate was 79%. That's worse than 1 in 5 failing. Nephrology, 83%. Sleep medicine, 83%, and in cardiology was 86%. Cardiology is worth a closer look. A peer-reviewed study published in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology tracked this trend specifically. They noted that the cardiology pass rates dropped from 96% in 2018 to 86% in 2021. That is a 10% drop. Literally worse than a 3 times increase in the percentage of people that are failing, and that hasn't recovered. Now, in fairness, the ABIM does publish what they call an ultimate pass rate, which means eventually people who take the test pass it at a 98% rate. On the surface, that sounds reassuring. What they're saying is that almost everyone passes, nothing to see here, but that number hides a lot. In other words, if you fail, you're waiting an entire year to retake. You're paying for the exam again. You also may have credentialing issues with your employer. One of the most common reasons that people work with us for coaching is that they'll say, well, if I am no longer board eligible or if I fail on another time, then I may lose my job. Some of the subspecialists that we work with in things like critical care or geriatrics have told us that they will literally have to go back to fellowship if they don't pass in a certain period of time. Plus, everyone deals with the emotional toll of having to tell their colleagues or potentially not telling them that they didn't pass. So the rates are dropping, but the question is why? And the most common answer that you'll hear is probably wrong or at least incomplete. The most cited explanation for why the ABIM failure rates is increasing is COVID. And there's lots of published research that speculates that this is the reason. A peer-reviewed viewpoint in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology argues that COVID training disruptions are the main culprit. Now, on the surface, the timing matches. Training truly was disrupted. There were people who had a lot of on-the-job training that was completely disrupted by the COVID pandemic. And the trend is extremely broad. It shows up across many different subspecialties, not just internal medicine. An important point that the JACC authors note is that the exam itself hasn't changed. The ABIM did a major overhaul of the test in 2015, but since then has not made any major changes to the test. Plus, the exam is not graded on a curve, so the passing score is a fixed standard. It's not like they just decided all of a sudden that they were gonna fail a bunch more people. In other words, if more people fail, it means that more people perform below a consistent benchmark. So, open and shut case, right? The COVID disrupted training, the timing matches, and the exam didn't change. But here's where it gets interesting. Because if COVID were the whole story, you'd expect the data to show something that it doesn't. There are 2 pieces of data that should make you question the COVID explanation. And as far as I can tell, nobody is connecting these dots. In addition to the fact that there was less on-the-job training, one of the most common reasons cited for how the COVID pandemic has affected people's ability to prepare for exams is the fact that burnout just completely skyrocketed. And the data bear this out. The AMA, the Mayo Clinic, and Stanford have been running a longitudinal burnout study published in the Mayo Clinic Proceedings that's been tracking physician burnout since 2011. In 2020, 38% of physicians reported burnout symptoms. However, by 2021, when the pandemic was really starting to get in full swing, it was 63%. That is the largest single-year spike in the history of the study, and the effects were across the board. Emotional exhaustion scores went up by nearly 40%. Depersonalization scores went up by over 60%. Plus, primary care physicians were hit the hardest. burnout rates reached nearly 58% in 2022. So on the surface, this would be a really clear explanation for why the ABIM failure rate has gone up by so much. Because again, primary care was hit the hardest. We see that the failure rate has nearly doubled over the last 10 years. However, something interesting happened. By 2023, the burnout was back down to 45%. This was roughly where it was in 2017. In other words, the burnout crisis, at least by this particular measure, had eased. However, the ABIM pass rates over that exact same period have still been dropping. If it were a burnout phenomenon stemming from COVID, you would expect that the ABIM pass rates would have gone up after burnout and training has improved. However, that is not true. Burnout spiked, came back down, but the pass rates have dropped and haven't come back. So if it's not burnout, maybe it's the fact that there was just less on-the-job training. But here's the other piece. The same cross-section of trainees that are failing the ABIM at a 14% pass rate are passing the USMLE Step 2CK at a 97 to 98% pass rate. Let that sink in for a second. Step 2CK, which just like the ABIM tests clinical knowledge, has been seeing steady or even improving pass rates. The ABIM, which also tests clinical knowledge, which presumably would have been hurt by the lack of on-the-job training and would have improved as on-the-job training had returned, is still declining. Now, obviously there's important differences. Step 2 is taken during or right after medical school when oftentimes you're given a full-time study mode. The ABIM is taken right after residency or while you're working as a full-time physician. But that's exactly the point. In addition, obviously Step 2 is taken on a greater importance in the era of Step 1 being pass-fail. So who knows, maybe Step 2 rates would be a lot lower had it not taken on so much more importance. However, it would be hard to argue that it was only the lack of on-the-job training that came from the COVID disruption because A, on-the-job training has increased since then, and B, another exam in which on-the-job training presumably would have been impacted has seen little to no impact in terms of the pass rates from the lack of on-the-job training. If you're a medical student or a doctor preparing for either the USMLEs or COMLEX or one of your medical board exams, then be sure to sign up for our free 14-step program where we'll walk you through the most efficient ways for you to improve your score in a short period of time. And if you're interested in getting there faster, be sure to book a free call with our team where we'll break down what it is that's holding you back and, if it makes sense, explain how it is that we can help you to get there more efficiently.